have come out here from California. So I'm pleased to introduce you all to Dr. Michael Méndez. He's an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. And he also was recently at FES at the Forestry School as the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot Faculty Fellow in Sustainability Studies. And he has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors, where he consulted and actively engaged in the policymaking process. This included work for the California State Legislature as a senior consultant, lobbyist, gubernatorial appointee, and as vice chair of the Sacramento City Planning Commission. And during his time as a scholar, he's contributed to state and national research policy initiatives, including serving as an advisor to California Air Resources Board. And as a participant in the Global Change Research Program's working group on climate vulnerability and social science perspectives. Most recently, he was appointed by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to the Board on Environmental Change and Society. In addition, he holds 3 degrees in environmental planning and policy, including a PhD from UC Berkeley and a graduate degree from MIT. And his research on the intersection of climate change and communities of color has been featured in several national publications. And in addition, I'm also going to give a quick spiel about his new book, Climate Change from the Streets, featured here, as well as on the table outside, and I'm sure available on many online websites as well. This book is, I think, a really inspiring and fascinating piece of literature out there. As I said, called Climate Change from the Streets, and in this book, he explores the perspectives and influence that low-income people of color bring to advocacy work on climate change. And in California, many activist groups have galvanized behind issues such as air pollution, poverty alleviation, and green jobs as a way to advance equitable climate solutions at local, state, and national and global levels. And this book is arguing in part that environmental protection and improving public health are inextricably linked, and that we must incorporate local knowledge, culture, and history into policy making in order to fully address the global complexities of climate change and the threats facing local communities. So we are truly thrilled to have Dr. Méndez here on campus to talk about his research, his work, and his new book, and to share with us his perspective on climate change and state and local action about climate change. So without further ado, welcome.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's such a pleasure and honor to be back here at FES, Yale Forestry Environmental Studies. After my 3 years as a faculty fellow, I had a great experience here. And I think only the students, a student-led conference could get me back less than a year in this cold and the snow. Because if anyone knows me, I'm a true California boy, and I hate the cold and I hate the snow. And I live by the beach now and love 70-degree weather. So I'm glad to be here with the students because this is a student-led conference, a very forward-thinking and progressive conference on environmental law and policy. And so that's why I made the trek out here to discuss my research with you. And I think it's also important to note sort of the history of this conference and the history of people of color at the Yale School of Forestry. I know for many of us as a faculty member as well as a student of color, it's a very difficult place to be sometimes, very isolating, very challenging. But at the same time, those challenges really give us an opportunity and a platform to speak about the issues we care about. I entered FES one person, and I really came out a different person. So to all the students of color or people from disadvantaged communities or whatnot, I say that there is life after FES. So that's a saying. I'm an MIT alum, and that's what all alumni used to say after graduating from MIT. There is life after MIT. There is life after FES. So I'm here to say thank you for the opportunity, and I did have a lot of opportunity to have different platforms and increase my teaching, my research that really looks at the intersection of people, place, and power in the context of climate change. And this research has been profiled in different places, including been recently endorsed by Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, and other EJ scholars throughout the country. So I thank you for that opportunity. And before I jump into sort of the major themes of my research, I want to provide a little bit vignette about how does this people, place, and power in the context of inequality and climate change relate to the environmental justice community. Specifically, how does the Green New Deal that we all hear about relate to climate change and environmental justice? So as many of you know, there's no other political in Washington, D.C. that has moved the issue of climate change to a national platform of prominence so quickly as Democratic Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her Green New Deal is a radical proposal to decarbonize America's economy while tackling inequality. It has stirred passionate reactions from both progressive and conservative factions throughout the country that serve as rallying calls for advancing their own interests and agendas. Progressives highlight the urgency of the climate crisis and the hard choices needed to address it, while conservatives argue that those choices are a continued expansion of the government's infringement on their personal liberties and freedoms. These divisions are reflective of the political, economic, and environmental moment in Washington, a historic time in which climate change is now part of the American vernacular, although with different meanings attached to it, and any proposal to directly address the issue is stalled in the Republican-controlled Senate and White House. The good news is any effort to bring the Green New Deal to fruition does not depend entirely on the federal government. For the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have pushed local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions in approaches that also address inequality and public health. These climate change experiments have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists such as NRDC and Nature Conservancy, who favor least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. And I'm here to say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. The history of these climate change street fights was conspicuously absent in the initial rollout of the Green New Deal. I first heard Elizabeth Young-Pierre, co-chair of the National Climate Justice Alliance, bringing these tensions to the foreground in March 2019 at this very conference last year, and was the keynote speaker. In her keynote presentation, Young-Pierre characterized certain groups affiliated with the Green New Deal as climate missionaries. She argued that they are focusing on marginalized communities where climate justice campaigns already existed, instead of doing the difficult work of developing new programs in conservative regions of the country without active grassroots organizations. She elaborated, quote, "They are getting a lot of resources to descend into our communities and supplant local leadership, duplicate work, and create redundancy, and making it impossible for frontline communities to speak for themselves." So in my research, that idea of speaking for themselves is a major theme. Later that month, at a 3-day meeting convened by the nonprofit affiliated with Ocasio-Cortez, I again witnessed strong conflict among environmentalists at this invite-only conference. During the opening plenary, over a dozen environmental justice activists from across the country protested the event. They accused organizers of tokenism and foregrounding meaningful consultation with environmental justice groups in developing the Green New Deal agenda. Through this confrontation, the organizers acknowledged their error and modified their process. To their credit, they spent the rest of the year building trust and collaborative relationships with environmental justice groups to better understand the complexities that will be necessary to achieve policy consensus at the local and national levels. So what we really want to understand here that groups have been really advocating for nearly the last 2 decades, nearly 20 years, about how to link greenhouse gas emissions with local inequality issues, and really understanding that these communities have the best answer for these issues. And what we really see often about the California narrative of its leadership around climate change is that mostly NRDC, EDF, Nature Conservancy, and mainly white coastal Democrats are leading the charge. But the fact is that California is not a homogeneous entity. There's a lot of consultation, a lot of conflict that is going on how we define climate change, how we define it as a problem, what type of knowledge we use, what type of knowledge we validate, and what role should low-income communities of color. And this book, recently published by Princeton University, continues that erasure of people of color leading around climate change. And this entire book they actually only mentioned people of color and the role that people of color that authored the major climate change legislation in California, basically only twice, and essentially a footnote in this entire book and in other academic research that you read about California's efforts around climate change. So that was one of the main goals of my book, is really how do we foreground, how do we tell that narrative of environmental justice, and how these groups are creating these climate experiments that are having leading as an example for the rest of the country. In California, these environmental justice groups have been really successful in getting some of the linking inequality to climate change. And after many years of fighting and conflict and then collaboration, we see a shift happen in California, where now that 35% of the funds that come from climate polluters must be invested directly in low-income communities of color. And that's only a 35 minimum. And the reality that nearly 50% of the funds from climate polluters go to these disadvantaged communities. And this has resulted in over $2 billion in investment. But again, this was a major fight and took very forms of iterations, lawsuits for this to actually happen. So the idea is, how do we broaden the worldviews around climate change and really focus on outcomes, particularly around human health and community well-being? And to acknowledge that these groups, traditional environmentalists, scientists, and people of color from these frontline communities, are often speaking from structural locations that are quite different. In the policymaking process, we also oftentimes want to be ahistorical and aracial, or intersectionality, and not acknowledge that people do have values and do bring in values and different types of ethics and perspectives and worldviews. And that's what was one of the main goals of really understanding that there existed two very different worldviews in California. So next, that was a short little opening. I want to provide a street atlas about the rest of the book and what I'll be covering in the presentation today. I'll provide a brief statement of my own worldview, my own positionality about my research, because I think that's important to be upfront about the positionality, my background, my research, my work experience on climate change and environmental justice issues. I'll follow it up with environmental justice as a field study and how it intersects with climate justice research. Next, I'll provide an overview of research methods. And then I'll jump into an empirical case study of forest offsets in the global south. So this is a case study that has created a significant amount of conflict in California and throughout the globe. So a brief note on my positionality. This research originated in my public policy work for California State Legislature during a 15-year period. This provided valuable insight into how the interaction of government, businesses, and NGOs shape climate change policy. My research is further influenced by my experience growing up in a Latino immigrant community of Los Angeles that faced multiple environmental threats. At the youth in Pacoima, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental injustices, whether protesting the siting of landfills or organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties. They sought to understand how these situations originated and sought alternatives to imagine different urban futures. This has focused my work on what the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change has meant to activists, policymakers, experts, and scholars. Understanding this is important because the idea of environmental justice has been growing in scope beyond the initial application to the inequitable distributions of hazardous waste dumps in poor communities of color. My work analyzes the expansion of environmental justice policy, discourse, and the ways in which it has challenged definitions of nature and society. When I began this research project in California, I was struck by the lack of scholarship on the narratives of environmental justice in the context of climate change. The literature shows a real neglect of environmental justice groups' worldview and influence in the climate change policy arena. This lack of narrative perspective is largely due to the fact that since the 1980s, environmental justice studies has sought to legitimize itself as a serious academic area of inquiry. The first generation of EJ scholars in general focus on causality and quantifying environmental inequity through the lens of race and class at a single scale. However, an emerging second generation has extended the field to incorporate a deeper consideration of critical theory and intersectionality, the ways in which gender, race, class, sexuality, and immigration status, and other categories of difference intersect to shape environmental justice struggles at multiple scales. So this looks at, even though a site-specific site at one scale, at the local scale, may be experiencing impacts, but understanding there are larger structural issues that you have to do to address environmental injustice and jump different policy scales that are interconnected. So this has really focused my research on 4 key questions on critical environmental justice studies in the book. The first is, how does intersectionality, multiple forms of difference, again, race, class, gender, sexuality, and immigration status, influence environmental justice, justice outcomes and struggles? The second is, to what extent should scholars focus on a single scale or multi-scale analysis of the causes and possible resolutions to environmental justice struggles? Again, looking at multi-scalar type of analyses. Third, to what degree do state power and market systems entrench social inequality? Here at FES and in the environmental policy arena, oftentimes we focus on market-based mechanisms or market environmentalism, or scholars will call neoliberal policies. So how do carbon pricing, cap and trade further exacerbate, if they do, inequality in these areas? And fourth, how can marginalized groups whose participation is indispensable to society shape sustainable collective futures? And again, that idea, allowing these communities to speak for themselves, acknowledging that they have their own embodied and local knowledge and should be actively and meaningfully addressed and included in the policymaking process. So therefore, I have a key argument in the book is for society to successfully resolve the phenomenon of climate change, critical attention must be placed on the human dimensions of climate policymaking, that is local knowledge, culture, and history, and at multiple scales. Central to this argument is the demonstration that environmental protection and improving public health are inextricably linked, and maintaining that link is a key to advancing future climate action policies. The case of California is particularly productive as an experiment. As the world's 5th largest economy and the only US state to implement a comprehensive program of regulatory and market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, California has consistently been at the forefront of broader national and global environmental experimentation. The state's cap and trade program is a central market-based mechanism for ensuring emission reductions, and is the 3rd largest in the world after the European Union and China. This program has been especially contentious in debates within California. Supporters emphasize its global reach and cost effectiveness, and detractors criticize its inequitable effects on specific local communities and demographic groups. California's prominence in climate policy makes it an ideal place to investigate the dynamics of such disputes and their roots in differing climate change worldviews. My multi-sided ethnographic policy analysis weaves together an analysis of 3 interconnected case studies. The first is climate and public health activism in 2 heavily impacted communities of color, Richmond and Oakland, California. The second is conflict over state-level carbon trading or pricing and the use of revenue for investment in local communities most harmed by air pollution. And the third, international and local implications of the forest conservation projects in the global south, in this case Mexico and Brazil, allowed under California's market-based climate change laws. These cases combine to reveal the contested politics of the local, state, and transnational levels of which California makes climate change policy and takes action. So for instance, activists in Richmond, California, they had the largest oil refinery west of the Mississippi, the Chevron refinery, and it happens to be the state's largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and also has to be one of the largest emitter of co-pollutants, such as NOx and SOx, some of the key ingredients that create smog and has local health benefits. So these individuals understand that if you want to have larger structural changes, they cannot just advocate and do activism within Richmond or Oakland, but they must travel simultaneously to other policy scales, such as Sacramento, to affect its cap and trade program or its statewide and global climate policies. At the same time, these individuals are also simultaneously working in global arenas, such as like United Nations and other type of organizations that the California is involved in, because California has a global carbon market, again, the third largest in the world after the European Union and China, and it has aspirations to be a larger carbon market. It's already connected to Canada, and it has aspirations in terms of forest offsets. These are forest conservation projects, carbon sinks, that they want to link up to Mexico and Brazil. So this is very contentious, and it's the main case study I'll be speaking about next. So there are three aims of this multiscalar research. The first is to demonstrate that public health and environmental justice perspectives can be central to the successful climate change policy development and implementation. Second is to offer an interdisciplinary framework for theorizing the kinds of negotiations between scales and worldviews that are involved in the development of equitable climate change policy. And finally, to provide a set of findings that activists can use to negotiate with governments that legitimizes their perspectives about the differential impact of climate change on disadvantaged communities. And the third one, again, goes back to allowing them to speak for themselves and ensuring that the erasure of people of color in California's global environmental leadership is not ignored anymore. So just briefly on my methods, as a multi-sided ethnographic study, my work draws on two main sources. Notes from my years observing policymaking in the Sacramento State Capitol, and extensive interviews with climate policymakers and environmental justice stakeholders from 2012 and 2015, with several follow-up interviews in 2017 and 2018. And this doesn't include any of my over 10 years and professional practice of my participant observer reflections. My participant observer reflections, content analysis, and semi-structured interviews provide valuable information on the conflicts and collaborations defining climate change and environmental justice in California. So now finally to an empirical case study around climate change. So we're going to be jumping, I will present the scale from this case study from my book, and here we will be jumping scales from the local to the global. We will see how the conceptualization of environmental justice as an organizing theme has spread horizontally throughout California, and how it is now vertically linked to the global south and Mexico and Brazil. And I think it's important to note here that in this case study, I know we have a lot of foresters, a lot of people really interested in these kind of offset studies, is that you have an open mind. Understand what are the perspectives and modes and logics that this social movement that is very influential in California and throughout the state, to understand where they're coming from, what are their worldviews. For California advocates, there has been a growing need to develop a global consciousness in the environmental justice movement. Activists recognize the importance of connecting local agendas with trends that they see nationally and internationally around climate change. In this case study, I examined how continued collaboration and experimentation and coalition building since 2010 has brought California EJ perspectives onto the global stage. This story centers around the ways in which carbon markets can create international links between local injustices and prompt new forms of translocal activism. A central figure in the story is Mary Rose Taruk, an activist with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, one of the leading environmental justice groups in California, and they're also based in Richmond, California. Interesting, her indigenous last name in Tagalog means to know. According to Mary Rose, the need to engage on a global stage became clear when APEN's Native American allies who represent sovereign nations were participating in United Nations debates on climate change policy. Native American advocacy groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network developed campaigns that brought U.S. environmental justice groups to the United Nations and other global spaces. In these arenas, California EJ groups learned how linking their local campaigns could also help indigenous communities in the global south. These interactions laid a strong foundation for new translocal efforts when California attempted to link its cap-and-trade system to Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil through forest offset credits. Carbon offsets allow California's polluting industries to pay someone else anywhere in the world to reduce their emissions by engaging in activities such as forest conservation. Forest offsets are also known as reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, or RED. In other words, RED offsets allow pollution at home only if developing countries keep their forests in the ground and intact and do not use their own natural resources. polluting businesses in the United States are allowed to continue to pollute, most often in low-income communities of color like Richmond and Oakland. California traditionalists, environmentalists such as EDF and the Nature Conservancy, polluting industries, and some large indigenous groups, these are larger indigenous groups that have formal land title, they are recognized by the state, support such offsets projects because of cost effectiveness, ecological enhancements to tropical forests, and benefit sharing opportunities with indigenous communities. These groups stress the need to combat tropical deforestation, that is the cutting and burning of trees to convert land to grow crops, extract oil, or raise livestock. It is estimated that such activities account for 20% of the Earth's human-caused carbon emissions. Polluting industries support forest offsets in the global south because they are significantly cheaper option for reducing carbon emissions when compared to domestic U.S. mechanisms. For California environmental justice groups, however, it seemed that RED likely would not address their local air pollution issues. They foresaw increased emissions in disadvantaged communities. Smaller indigenous groups in Acre and Chiapas, these are the ones that are not recognized by the state and do not have land title, argued that the new value of pristine forest reserves could motivate landowners to evict forest-based indigenous communities, especially in a region like Chiapas, where there's a long history of violent conflict over land rights. To them, RED could exacerbate local environmental problems and perpetuate historic injustices. Thus, in response, a new translocal coalition emerged between South and North social movements. Here again, we see how notions of environmental justice travel and are horizontally and vertically linked. This translocal coalition, moreover, argues for a systems thinking or a feedback loop approach in climate change policy. For example, they claim U.S. Imports of crude oil from the Amazon are driving the destruction of some of the rainforest ecosystem's most pristine areas and releasing large amounts of greenhouse gases. According to an Amazon Watch study, American refineries processed over 230,000 barrels of Amazon crude oil a day. And California represents a large majority, an average of 171,000 barrels, comprising 74% of all Amazon crude imports to the United States. For Mary Rose, it was a hostile incident that solidified her determination against RED and towards a systems thinking approach to climate policy. At a 2010 United Nations meeting in Cancun, she was detained and tossed out of climate negotiations for holding a sign opposing carbon offsets. She was quoted as saying, "You would think I would be afraid after that experience, but actually I was encouraged because to the right of me at the protest was the former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, and to the left of me were leaders of the social movements from the Western Hemisphere, from the MST Brazil and the Via Campesina de Mexico. And in front of me were Native American brothers and sisters from the Indigenous Environmental Network who have been campaigning to end red forest offsets." Working together in person and via conference calls throughout 2011 and 2012, California environmental justice groups and indigenous rights groups organized an opposition campaign. Through this process, they were able to overcome concerns of groups from Mexico and Brazil that California activist groups might sell them out through carbon market trading and revenue sharing opportunities. After several collaborative negotiations, they eventually forged a common understanding about the spatial implications and global reach of California's carbon market, highlighting potential harm of those living among the trees and those living next to polluting forests, industries, that is. The debate is so contentious because California has, again, the third largest carbon market in the world. The implication here is if California adopts it, the rest of the world will follow. While policymakers in California proclaimed the benefits of forest offsets at international events, several indigenous groups from the global south protested the lack of consultation during the development of a proposal that could impact their lands and livelihoods. The first major global protest against California's carbon market occurred on September 26, 2012, where over 40 indigenous protesters from the Lancon jungle and members of international NGOs gathered outside the governor's Climate and Forest Task Force meeting in Chiapas, Mexico. The task force was funded by the state of California and brought together government and business officials dedicated to implementing RED policies globally. They represented 16 local governments of 6 countries, that is Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, the United States, Peru, and Nigeria, and between them held 20% of the world's forests. Among the most vocal protesters at the task force meeting was Ufima Sanchez, a Mayan indigenous leader from the remote jungles of Chiapas. Denied a chance to address the meeting, Sanchez seized the microphone during the opening plenary and spoke before a packed auditorium of several hundred participants. She was quoted as saying, quote, "We have come before you today to denounce the programs and projects that threaten to dispossess us of our territories. Why do the wealthy want to impose their will by force? The jungles are sacred and they exist to serve the people. We don't come to your countries and tell you what to do with your lands and lives. We ask for the same respect," end quote. Ufima's rejection of offsets invoked the nature of the forest as a home, as a historically contested territory and a sacred space. Her intervention highlights how climate policy maps onto existing cultural meanings and social and historical dynamics concerning property and politics. For example, in this one protest, we see a sign in Spanish that says, the government of Chiapas is lying to us. They didn't inform us, they didn't consult us, and we don't want red. So here the implication is that under United Nations law, there has to be prior and informed consent. And the allegation here is that that didn't occur before California set up this global task, this global forest group and their MOUs to start forest offsets and protocols. 3 weeks after the Forest Task Force meeting, an international delegation of indigenous leaders from Brazil, Mexico, and Ecuador traveled to Sacramento to register their opposition in person at the California Air Resources Board public hearing on October 18, 2012. The delegation was hosted by Friends of the Earth and several California environmental justice organizations. While digital media communications aided the development of the South-North exchange, activists understood that physical sites of assembly were still the most effective way to collectively address resistance and challenge the dominant power. California represented the locus of power, and it is the only local jurisdiction in the world considering red offsets. The presence of indigenous leaders alongside California environmental justice advocates, moreover, showcased a narrative of the potential South-North environmental injustice derived from California's global market-based solutions. In other words, it was a symbolic reminder of the spatial and human implications of carbon markets. So here we had advocates from Chiapas, Mexico, speak out against these red projects at the California Air Resources Board. And one of the advocates from Chiapas presented this brochure that the state of Chiapas distributed at the 2010 Conference of the Parties. This is the United Nations conference around climate change. And here they detail how this brochure details that 172 illegal groups were relocated in efforts to avoid deforestation. And the allegations or claims that were being made here is that California hasn't even linked its program to Chiapas, Mexico, and people are already being dispossessed from their land. An indigenous leader from Ecuador, Brazil, also spoke out in opposition. Ninoa, president of the Unique Federation of Unique People, also spoke. He was quoted as saying, "Indigenous people are feeling the effects of offset programs. They are restricting our way of life and our ability to have access to our traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering sites. So for this reason, we are urging you not to accept red offsets in your trading program." Environmental justice groups also spoke out in opposition and expressed their solidarity of how this potential program can affect forest people, as well as those living next to industrial sites. When the board hearing concluded, members of the Translocal Coalition continued their lobbying efforts at the state capitol. They met with legislative leaders and presented them with a letter signed by more than 30 California-based organizations opposing red. Following the Capitol Lobby Day, the coalition organized a no red tour throughout Northern California. Coalition members sought to educate the public and about the effects of the offset programs of people living in both industrialized and forest regions. The tour led to a larger policy discussion within the Capitol and within the news media as well over California's ability to monitor the integrity of international offsets in developing countries. For example, the legal scholar Alan Ramo noted that any international offset program implemented in a developing country would depend on the host country or third parties for validation. Corruption at any stage, including initial reporting, verification, and monitoring, could undermine offset programs. Rommel's comments, influenced by the visibility of the Translocal Coalition, further raised concerns with Capitol staffers. These included whether the state could monitor international offsets in the same manner as domestic ones. The state, unlike the federal government, lacks international authority to enforce provisions or intervene in another country's sovereignty. Several senior Capitol staff members that I spoke with said that California should be cautious developing linkages where doing so would induce or exasperate human rights violation in the global South. At a RED panel that I hosted here in 2006, California Air Resources Board member Dean Flores commented that regulators were walking a fine line, balancing in-state political pressures with the goal of combating global climate change. And he was quoted as saying, "Are we trying to save California, or are we trying to save the world?" In some sense, the answer may be both. Flores identified international forest offsets as one of the most controversial issues facing the board. He added that the Translocal Coalition has done a good job in highlighting the alleged negative aspects of offsets, which makes it more difficult for the board to quickly adopt the program. Throughout 2012, California environmental justice groups, advocates, and indigenous leaders demonstrated how powerful networks coalitions could shape environmental narratives of carbon reductions. During the next 5 years, the Translocal Coalition helped stall momentum towards the adoption of international forest offset program. Most importantly, its protests created some level of uncertainty in the market and in the policy world. Today, the issue continues to be contentious and unresolved in Sacramento. This form of translocal activism is consistent with Margaret Keck and Catherine Shishink's research on global human rights activism. What the authors term the boomerang pattern can be observed in the way in which NGOs in the global South work with similar domestic groups in the global North. In the case of translocal opposition to RED, indigenous groups in Chiapas and Oaxaca protested their government, State A, to stop the development of the offset programs. However, due to the relative weakness of civil society in Mexico and Brazil, meant that some of the groups lacked sufficient power to influence their governments and could even be targets of repression, which is diagrammed in the pattern of blockage up there. So this led them to seek out help for other individuals outside of their countries, particularly in the global North. The Global North organization's comparison had a greater freedom of action and benefited from stronger civil societies. Information sharing and collaboration between the regions led California environmental justice groups to protest their government, State B, and to try to block the program. Therefore, under the boomerang model, we see that California policymakers, perhaps not wanting to be viewed as adopting policies that could provoke human rights abroad, began to slow down the process of approval of global offsets. And again, this issue has remained contentious and debated and unresolved in Sacramento today. Therefore, through these efforts, anti-RED activists are challenging the worldviews that are considered valid within California's decision-making on climate change. The Translocal Coalition posed a fundamental question. Who has the power to protect nature and humanity from the existential threat of climate change? The answer has emerged through various forms of conflict and collaboration. California's climate change policy increasingly depends on the ways in which it incorporates marginalized voices within the state and around the globe. So some key findings from this translocal case study around RED. The first is that distinct groups formed an anti-RED coalition and campaign based on diverse worldviews and histories. Environmental injustice is interconnected. EJ groups travel across geographies and scales to effectively address them, and there are spatial implications of carbon markets. Third is the coalition challenged state power in the North and South, rejecting global structures and narratives that perhaps could be seen as embedding environmental injustices within California's climate solutions. And then finally, instead of market-based climate solutions, EJ groups argued for more equitable alternatives. However, there's limitations and a lot of challenges around this type of activism. First is there are unequal power dynamics between global North and global South activists. There's divergent perspectives and priorities among global South indigenous groups, U.S. Native American tribes, and California environmental justice groups themselves. As I mentioned before, the larger indigenous groups that have formal land title and are recognized by the state strongly support these RED offsets. And even U.S. Native American tribes in California and throughout also support this and are helping their similar tribes in Acre and Mexico to try to set up these global offsets. And third, state power and market forces could co-opt the environmental justice movement. That really means the greenwashing through social equity safeguards that really don't address some of the key and structural issues that the environmental justice groups are protesting. And finally, RED is an unresolved issue. They have not adopted an official program. There's a protocol, but they haven't adopted to link up the programs yet. So that's many years ahead, a couple years ahead. So there's difficult sustaining translocal coalitions over time. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resources to maintain such coalitions. So before I end, what are the broader theoretical implications of this type of research? What does it mean? What is unique about this conflict and collaboration in climate change policy and politics? Through my more than 10 years of research, I came to see a tension between different worldviews around climate change, as I mentioned before. Those of scientists, mainstream environmental groups, and policy makers, and those of environmental justice activists. While these worldviews are not absolute, they are the generalization of the dynamics initially observed within California, particularly through the period of 2006 when they adopted the first climate change law, and 2012. In the first worldview, I generally saw one based on utilitarianism, efforts to develop climate policy for the greatest good, for the greatest number. I call this worldview carbon reductionism, an adherence to cost effectiveness and market-based solutions focus on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions without any social equity and local health considerations for the most polluted communities. Under this worldview, my research generally saw and observed governments being judged whether their policies are cost-effective and benefit the majority. So under carbon reductionism, there's a strong emphasis on greenhouse gas reduction potential. And that's often measured in tons of CO2 equivalent, because we all know that carbon is the most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And there's this strong scientific framing, very top-down, of who's considered an expert, whose knowledge is validated within this process, so it's very detached expertise from the local community. And there's this strong emphasis on cost effectiveness. How can we reduce carbon emissions most cost effectively without having a major shock to the economy? And this is often done through market-based solutions, such as California's cap and trade program, which again I mentioned was the third largest in the world. And this cap and trade program is seen as being geographically neutral. It does not matter where you reduce carbon emissions, so long as you reach that global reduction target of 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050. So you could do all your reductions in Beverly Hills, or you can do them in Compton. It really doesn't matter under this sort of geographic neutrality. And in the early years, at the beginning in 2006, there was only an emphasis on mitigation and not adaptation. So conversely, environmental justice groups generally held a moral rights worldview. I dubbed their worldview climate change from the streets, a critical reevaluation of both the practice and politics of reducing carbon emissions. The worldview considers social equity, and argues that a utilitarianism approach ignores distinctions between people and the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income communities of color. My research observed this environmental justice worldview as participatory, embodied, and experimental. So under climate change from the streets, there's this strong emphasis on co-benefits potential, not just greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions, but understanding that the same processes of fossil fuel combustion that create greenhouse gases or carbon also create local emissions, NOx and SOx, particulate matter, the ones that affect our local health. But in climate change policy, those are separated and policy siloed. Here, environmental justice groups really advocate for co-benefits, co-pollutants approach that focuses on greenhouse gas emissions and other co-pollutants, and particularly focusing on health. So there's this strong contextual framing, understanding, accepting different types of knowledge and different types of experts in the policymaking process. And there, of course, is an emphasis on cost effectiveness, but there's also an emphasis on social equity. So cost effectiveness should not happen at the expense of equity or justice. So there's also an emphasis on community-based solutions, that these mitigation projects or adaptation projects should be happening first in the most polluted communities, like those in Richmond that has the Chevron refinery, which is the largest oil refinery, again, west of the Mississippi. And there's an emphasis on multi-scalar, that geographic neutrality does not matter. And then finally, in the early years, environmental justice groups were one of the first groups to really focus on adaptation, understanding that the impacts of climate change were already happening and that local adaptation policies should be put forward. So however, many of you may see this as just a simple dichotomy or straw man. However, its use is important to highlight a critical analysis of a contentious politics of scale, markets, and race, and it helps us as scholars and environmentalists to understand that these actors, again, involved in the climate policy making arena are often speaking from structural locations that are worlds apart. However, in 2012, I did witness a big change in climate policy making, and it became more participatory and synergetic. Through a recurring process of conflict and collaboration, a broad range of individuals or organizations are now co-producing what climate change means. As geographer Mike Hume argues, this tension between worldviews can have a balancing, even creative impact, yielding stronger, more robust approaches to resolving climate change. Furthermore, worldviews are not fixed and can transform over time. Scientific ideas and beliefs about climate change evolve together with the representations, identities, debates, and institutions that give practical effect and meaning to policies. In other words, the ways in which we conceptualize climate change policy don't just happen. People are behind our government policies and environmental values, and they can change their minds. For instance, former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was seen as really trying to create these policy silos and not wanting to deal with public health or environmental justice in California's climate change policies, it began to change his mind. And most recently, at a 2017 conference of the parties in Bonn, Germany, he was quoted as saying, there are not enough climate conferences about people who die from cancer because they live too close to the freeway or a port. So again, we see the changing between conflict and collaboration that's changing worldviews and ideologies and perspectives around climate change. And this was further supported by a former senator and Air Resources Board member Dean Flores that said 10 years ago we weren't intentional about environmental justice or linking climate change to public health. It didn't happen until now because of these street fights that these environmental justice groups did. I attribute this co-productionist framework as being underscored by the narrative of embodiment. Environmental justice groups are pushing new hypotheses, as well as evaluating existing ones around climate change problems and solutions. They are calling for multiple ways of knowing and learning and understanding around climate change. Through my years of interviews, I observed how environmental justice groups centered their work on telling stories of how their bodies bear the marks of environmental interactions. They framed their work on the human embodiment of climate change and carbon's associated co-pollutants. For them, the body is where diverse points of pollution, social stratification, and poverty intersect. I call this way of knowing and learning climate embodiment, a concept that draws on ecofeminist theory in the field of public health. For example, environmental justice activists in Richmond argue for a holistic understanding of the links between the infrastructural body, that is the extraction of raw materials for the construction of buildings, to the contaminated human body. In other words, we begin to imagine a form of climate embodiment that represents a continuum, where the human body cannot be divorced from its environment, and environmental solutions cannot be isolated from the human body. So this idea of climate embodiment really takes the idea of life cycle analysis, or systems thinking approach, where in architecture, they looked at embodied carbon. How do the construction of a building, the raw materials from the extraction to transportation, embody carbon? But environmental justice activists argue that it's just equally important to understand how does that construction of buildings impact the human body in terms of human health, as well as impact to the environment. So finally, in conclusion, this embodied research represents new models of engagement with climate change that make space for alternative paradigms of environmental protection. My engagement with stakeholders since 2006 has allowed me to critically analyze how the success of climate policy in California is now depends on incorporating marginalized communities and voices and embodied perspectives from the local and global scales. So thank you again for this opportunity, and we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Michael. I love this, and I don't think we can be reminded too often about the fact that power and the power structure is at the heart of how we approach climate change and other environmental issues. So when I talk about this, I often get asked the question or the criticism that I'd like you to help me figure out how to answer, which is, okay, everything you're saying is true, but we need to act fast and now on climate change. And when you're talking about power structures and moving away from perhaps neoliberal climate policy, you're going to slow down the process. The big corporate leaders have the power to do this and do it fast, and to some extent are doing it. If we move away from that, we may have an intergenerational problem because we may not solve climate change quickly enough. And I'm never entirely sure how to answer that, other than to concede the point and say I think justice is more important. But I'd like to know how you respond to that, so that I can do better.
Thank you for that question, and thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you today about my perspectives. And again, I just want to make it clear that I'm providing a narrative and perspective that has not been told before. Again, in California's global leadership, I'm not saying that those are particularly my perspectives, but I'm uplifting a constituency and a key social movement that has not had a voice or brought to the agenda before. I think this idea of expediency has always existed. I spent over 10 years in Sacramento working in the legislature as a lobbyist and various other positions. So I speak of this from the practitioner. I'm not just some academic that just spouting out, but I speak from being in the trenches and working with individuals and seeing how we go with legislation. But I also see when legislation fails, because legislation often or policies fail because they didn't incorporate different perspectives. They didn't bring people to the table, and it comes back to bite them. And I think that's what we have the challenge here, that this could happen in other places where it fails. And we see that happen in Washington with their own carbon pricing that did not bring the environmental justice groups. A lot of the people that I interviewed and worked with were the environmental justice groups were in California, were in direct talks with the environmental justice groups in Washington. So again, this horizontal and vertical linkage of social movements is important, especially in this new digital world that we live in. The rapid fire information gathering and communication happens. So I think if you want to bring more people to the table, you want to ensure a scientifically sound and a socially robust climate policy, you have to be intentional. Intentionality in policy is important. We all have, when a legislator or policymaker or policy entrepreneur introduces legislation, they have their perspectives, they have their values that they have. And understanding that you have to work together to bring them, or otherwise it's ultimately going to fail. Back there.
Coming at me from both sides. I'm wondering about language and whether you saw a difference in the way that activists talk about climate change, maybe not even using the term, and the way that we would talk about climate change in this room, and whether actually part of the problem that we have in bringing together the two movements you're speaking about is one of the core language, the core terms that we're using. Yeah. And if that's so, which kinds of terminology should we be using, and which language could bring us together?
I think even beyond the traditional environmentalists and environmental justice groups is looking at conservative rural areas, looking at the Panhandle of Florida, looking at rural Louisiana, the Appalachians. What is the language can we use that cuts across? California, again, is often looked at this homogeneous area. The Central Valley has some of the worst air quality, some of the worst poverty, economic issues, and they have a lot of legislators there that are conservative. And particularly in 2006, many of them voted against this bill, and it didn't move forward. And it was originally offered by a coastal Democrat, white Democrat that represented Malibu, and could not advocate and reach these legislators that were representing these conservative rural and suburban areas. Increasingly, these legislators from the rural areas and suburban areas were Latino. And they didn't want to support this because they have a different experience with the environment. They come from the Central Valley is the second largest oil producer in the United States after Texas. So a lot of people don't remember that about California. California is the second largest oil producer in the state. And what really turned the tides is, again, focusing on outcomes and community well-being, being able to show that if I'm going to vote for this controversial legislation, how am I going to make it worthwhile for my constituents? How am I going to be able to defend myself? Displacing jobs. So really focusing on outcomes such as public health, which is detrimental to these communities. How is this going to improve public health? How is this going to create new jobs within their regions? Is probably the most successful sort of campaigns I've seen happen in conservative rural or suburban districts. So that language of focusing on outcomes and benefits, because you often think that environmental agendas or climate change agendas don't create any benefits in those communities. And quite frankly, there's not a long history of environmental groups working strongly in some of those areas. So again, creating that language, common language like you mentioned, and that history. So I started my presentation about history. And that history takes time to build up that history, acknowledge that history, and build these collaborations. So that also rhymes up with Josh's question about expediency. So oftentimes it's hard to do both. But it's a challenge that we have to be intentional about our actions.
We'll take two more. So one, two. Go first and then.
Thanks. You just mentioned the need to.
Who's speaking?
Who's speaking? Am I speaking? I'm speaking. Okay, great. Can you follow up on the jobs question?
Yes.
So the public health question, I think, is self-evident. Obviously, you're living near a refinery, a toxic waste facility. You're going to get sick. That needs to be shut down. But at the same time, that's where the employment is. So how have these movements of marginalized groups living in these areas been able to mobilize to, I guess, structurally, I mean, the need is to actually structurally change the economy so that the nature of work is changed? And have there been any actual successes in making that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have this extra slide that EJ should be a part of climate policy. It's what activists also talk about. And it should not be left to chance or addressed later. And they think that market systems shouldn't matter or have trickle-down environmental policy. But I think linking it up to jobs, again, is an important issue. Initially, when California adopted its cap-and-trade program or climate change programs, again, there was this geographic neutrality. And saying that it didn't matter where we reduce emissions. And that's why a lot of conservative Latino Democrats and suburban Latino Democrats were representing Orange County did not want to vote for these bills because it didn't have a geographic focus. So I think the fight had been really to how do you create an intentional climate change policy that addresses place? When you're talking about a global emission. So as we all know, GHGs are global emissions. They do not affect local health, but they mix uniformly in the atmosphere. But how do you create a geographic priority around there? And I think that's what the environmental justice groups were, again, able to do, say that these jobs, these benefits, we're gonna go first to these localities. And then I think that's when the tide sort of changing, and you see these legislators and even community groups that weren't supporting climate change now see that $2 billion coming in, and it's over $2 billion now, and they really see the benefit now and how climate change could be climate change policy could benefit their hometowns and communities.
So what sort of jobs actually did happen with the money that came in?
So that's still being analyzed, but a lot of them are the renewable jobs around solar, and I know that's a small thing, but that's been the largest one that they've been focusing on.
So I think I'm next. So I'm from Baltimore, and Baltimore, like Richmond, have sued the fossil fuel industry for the damages inflicted upon us of climate change so that we have the funds to do the kind of mitigation and adaptation that we need to do to protect our populations. But you pretty much condemned the red global reforestation carbon offsets. And I wonder whether it was just because of the way California did it and the scale it was being done on. Because I know of one example, not knowing all that much about it, but it sounds good from what I know about it, of Duke University doing reforestation in Oaxaca and delivering the checks directly to a indigenous cooperative that has land held in common.
Yeah.
And they reforested a mountain, which brought back the hydrologic cycle, and they could raise crops again and things like that. So I wonder, do you know of examples where it's done well, or should it just be taken off the table completely?
No, there are. That's a great question. Thank you for that. There are several projects that have been done well throughout the globe. Most of these are voluntary projects, or these are payment for eco-service system type of projects. And again, these are with indigenous groups that do have formal land title. I think the case, and they have more political standing to negotiate better benefit sharing opportunities before they can actually get the checks that you're talking, the payments for eco-service systems. But I think what happened in California, it did happen because of this expediency thing. They wanted to be this global leader and expand its global carbon market and be the first local jurisdiction to have a forest offset program linked to its cap and trade program. And with that sort of rush, a lot of steps were left behind. It was never acknowledged the reason of why these two jurisdictions, Acre, Brazil, and particularly Chiapas, which has the longest history of forest conflict from the Zapatista to modern day. Why would you want to start your program with such an area with such fierce land tactics? And who was creating these reports around these issues, and the individuals supporting these projects? Did they have existing projects in these regions themselves that they wanted to be adopted as official carbon offset programs with cap and trade? I think so. There was a lot of questions that individuals wanted to have answered, and I guess it really rubbed the individuals the wrong way. And the idea of these going back to California and these environmental justice groups having a California first perspective, if you agree that or agree with it or you don't, is that why allow these polluters like Chevron to be able to buy their way out, even outside of cap and trade, buy their way out through forest offset programs when they should be reducing reductions on site. So that's the biggest thing for environmental justice groups, is that these polluters may ramp up operations through and buy more forest offsets instead of adopting new technologies and reduce pollution systems at home. And I like to mention that cap and trade credits are very different from forest offset credits. Forest offsets credits happen on a different market. The cap and trade is an auction run by the state. And particularly under the forest offsets, the information about who's buying and selling is considered proprietary and trade secret. So the idea again here is that you don't know who's buying, who's selling, and that also rubbed the transparency issue, rubbed the environmental justice groups wrong, versus a traditional command and control or direct emissions reductions. You know firsthand who's reducing, versus the other one happens in sort of a black box. So groups are uninformed about reductions and where they're happening or if they're happening at all.
Thank you again, Dr. Méndez. Can we get one more round of applause for our speaker? Thank you again, and for all of our conference participants, we're going to start with there's some food and drink out in the lobby, so please enjoy and chat with speakers. And in addition, we have some white posters hung up on the wall near the registration desk with questions, and we're really trying to encourage people to think about those questions, and there are markers there to write something on the board, and it's just a more informal, participatory way of gathering feedback about your thoughts. So we encourage you to do that as you're